Hello there, sword fans. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. This is the Thaitsuki S05 Katana, and before I get into the review, some caveats, some disclaimers, if you will. One, this is a free review sample from Thaitsuki, so do know I didn't spend any money on it. If you think that makes me biased, you know at the start. I don't know, actually, if I'm supposed to send it back. Cryptic communication is happening a little bit. I'm not entirely sure if I'm supposed to send it back or what the plan is. Anyway, I didn't spend any money on it, and you know that at the start. Two, I do study Japanese-style swordsmanship, and I have I've practiced for a minute now, and I've also done a lot of reviews, but I don't fancy myself an expert in either of those. So also keep that in mind as you hear my babbles throughout the course of this video. Now, this video is intended to help you decide if a sword like this is worth your hard-earned money or not. And at $3,000, it has, quite the expectation. It's towards the higher end spectrum of mass production swords. This isn't quite mass production, but it falls in line with the Moto-habas and Citadels and other very high end and therefore high expectation products out there. So I'm going to go over all the bits, bob, fit features, build quality, talk about them, give my opinions, but hopefully let you make your own with the high-res video I'll share. And then also I'll talk about the experience of moving it around as a practitioner, how well it cut and moved around in that regard as a practitioner as well, but and actually using it for closer to its intended purpose and cutting and whatnot. And then I'll sum it up if I think it's worth it or not. Anyway, that's the purpose here. One thing to note is I'm not planning on breaking this sword. One, I'm not entirely sure if I'm supposed to send it back or not, so I should probably get clarity on that before I take it to the Groke stake of doom. And two, I don't think too many people buying a Thaitsuki S05 or considering it are curious, other than for novelty and entertainment's sake, how many licks it takes to get to the center of the Tootsie Pop when I whack it into a metal pole in my backyard. So I'm not sure it's going to be super useful here. I have pushed it a little bit though, and you'll see that later in the cutting, and hopefully it's enough. And if it's not, I suppose let me know. If I'm not supposed to send it back, I can be a little more aggressive with it. Anyway, on with the show. So again, do know this is $3,000. That's a frame of mind that I'm going to be putting it in. As I look at this, I'm comparing it in my mind to other relatively high-end products. Now, it's not as high-end as a custom Nihonto from Japan. Those probably start at $10,000 or more. It's not as high-end as a custom-made one-of-a-kind sword from a smith of note in the United States, where you go through the process of sending all of these things to a bunch of different craftsmen and getting it done. But it is in the same category as other high-end pieces from Moto-haba Evolution Blades, Citadel, from MAS, from Hanwei. There are other people that are kind of in that category, but namely I think of Citadel and Evolution Blades. Anyway, on with the bits and bobs and fits and features. So the kashira, the end cap, the little pommel down at the end here. Note that these are made of silver. So that's one positive thing that stands out, is there are some precious metals used here. It's made out of silver, and unfortunately that's the nice part about it. It is a little bit on the small side. That's an aesthetic choice, but it also was quite wiggly and moved around some. And so it didn't take very long for this kashira to come off. It wasn't secured on there. Fortunately, I caught it and I tried to tie it in, and I tried to apply some little bits of glue and get it on there. That didn't work, so then I had to tie it down and then spray lacquer the whole thing to get it to really stay. But it is made of silver. Unfortunately, the casting on it is just not great. There are minor little spots that appear rough, spots where there was an opportunity to include some additional dimension and taper. And again, $3,000, you're kind of expecting a lot. Just kind of having a cast piece of silver with, mediocre finish work on it is not necessarily ideal. It's polished, but I really don't think I should see any imperfections on the fittings at all in a sword of this price point, and I do. I also think that making a really small fitting here was not a great choice. I think there are ways that if you don't have the ability to tie the ito as tight as one might like, that there are things that you can do to mitigate the chances that it's going to come loose. And one of them would be more of a handachi style fitting, or at least a bigger fitting where you could get more adhesive on the end. This didn't really have much, and thus it came loose and was really, unfortunately, it's right at the start of the video, is one of the major deterrents of using this sword was that this came loose quickly, and it was just a struggle to deal with and to put it back on, to try gradually more invasive things to get it on there. Now it's on there pretty good, but the knots are not as pleasant looking as they once were. Moving down from the fuchi, which the transitions and all that kind of stuff also were not great. But moving down to the ito here, this again is a problematic side of things. So the ito itself, in terms of tightness, was okay at first, and that was an improvement. Originally I tested 2 Thaitsuki S02s. I actually went to Thailand and I talked to Jack about some of the stuff and about my reviews, and he noted that, hey, that's a serious point and that they're going to try and improve on it. And it was improved. It was tighter, and I don't know if it's the climate difference or what causes the looseness, because the examples that I got to see at his office were not as loose as the examples that I had tested in the past, and this was at least an improvement, I would say. The Ito was indeed tighter, but it was still not as tight as it should be. Again, at $3,000, the Citadel and Evolution blades that it's competing with are all really tight, and so much that I can really put like my whole body weight on one of the knots, and they don't really move around. Now, other companies might charge $3,000. MAS, Hanwei, they're a little bit more on par with what Thaitsuki is offering here in terms of them not being particularly tight. But there are companies out there that offer very nice swords and have very tight Ito. Unfortunately, this was not as tight as I would like it. It would get a pass, but I when we're talking $3,000, the C level, technically you're tight enough is not what you're looking for. You're looking for better performance, better craftsmanship, better assembly, all that kind of stuff. So I would say it wasn't on par with what your expectations might be for a sword in this price point. Now, apart from that, if I look at the rest of the handle, the diamonds do wander around a little bit. Another not so great feature. The skin underneath here is actually pretty nice and has large nodules and is pleasant. I don't see an emperor node, not a requirement here, but the nodules are at least nice, and it's a higher end skin. There is a silver manuki in here that are reasonably well done. They're pretty detailed, and I can make out. Well, anyway, I think they're really quite nice fittings. They're a centipede or a millipede, and they blend in quite well. The Ito as well was this kind of crimsony red color, and it blends really well with the saya, and it's not always easy to get the two colors to match well to the eye. Often they look like two different reds, and it can be a little bit jarring, but here they actually match pretty well. That was nice. Unfortunately, the Ito as well, when it came to me, had some very minor frays in some spots, and also some parts that looked not entirely clean. And again, nitpicky here. It's a review sample too, so I'm not necessarily complaining for me personally. But if it came that way new, I would expect the Ito to not have frays in it. Even little ones at $3,000, I'm really expecting, well, some degree of fraying on silk is natural if you're really looking at it close, but there shouldn't be like errant bunches of threads sticking out. And there were a couple spots on here where it, looked like something snagged or something like that and pulled a few threads loose. Also, it looked like there's some darker stains. Those things shouldn't be present on a brand new $3,000 sword. The other thing to note is that the handle, I haven't really minded it, but it is a bit on the bulbous side. So if I show you it this way, you can see that it really kind of swings out wide here and then stays pretty wide. It's not problematic to grip, but it does fill the meat of your hand quite well. It's not easy to grip, and it certainly wouldn't be my preference. Considering it has relatively small fittings, a little bit more slender a grip I think would be better. I imagine that they break easier. There's a reason that it's as thick as it is, but if it's going to be thicker, then I think some other choices could be made to make it blend a little bit better. And also probably have some of this bulge taken out, because I don't know that there's necessarily a reason for it to be there, other than maybe it was the skin or the manuki, or I'm not sure what. But shape-wise, it's a little bit off. All right, I think there are Hishigami squares in here as well. Anyway, the fuchi. Well, there is a slight rim on this side, very minor, but again, $3,000 and being nitpicky. And there is some additional texture and whatnot in here, and I don't make out at least as many imperfections, but there is like a little sanded line and stuff like that. And again, not unexpected. Cast fittings often have some tooling marks on them, but you're just hoping that you don't see as many as you do when you're talking about something that's this much. And I can't imagine it would take too much hand filing to get some of those details ironed out and to get them smoother. The seppa as well have a nice detailed pattern in. They don't overshadow very much, but they're in there, and also silver. The tsuba, I think, is a little bit of a miss here for me. So it looks basically like a piece of copper that's been patinated or painted. I think it's got a patina on it though. It's held up reasonably well, but it's very, very small and thin, and it's an opportunity that could have had a raised rim. It could have had some additional silver detailing. It could have done a little bit more than be a very small, thin copper plate. Now, this is an aesthetic choice. I don't see anything inherently flawed with it, other than it seems a little bit out of place with the rest of the sword, and a missed opportunity to include some additional details and faceting and cool stuff, which I see on other Thaitsuki swords, frankly. They have a Tambo katana that has all sorts of detailing on the scabbard and whatnot. This one, just aesthetically, I don't think it fits well, but it is an aesthetic thing. Tsuba-wise, it does the things a tsuba should do. It's reasonably tight, and it's a crossguard. It just doesn't have much in the way of detail on it. Next, I'm going to talk about the habaki. Now, the habaki seems a little bit short, in contrast to citadels that seem a little bit long. It's made of silver, which is nice. It has some detailing. It looks different and interesting, and it also does the things that habakis should do. It holds in the blade tension-wise right, and it also, well, it looks nice. And I think I've seen historic examples that also are a little bit on the nubby side. But this is a big blade, so the habaki being a little bit short looks a little bit off. And I suppose when you're making it out of precious metals, there's maybe a desire to use less material than more, but I think the habaki should be just a little bit bigger, a little bit longer, taller anyway. Before I move on to the blade, I'll talk about the scabbard here, and there's some other cool stuff to note here. So one, silver koiguchi area here, silver kurigata, silver kojiri down at the end, this little end cap right here. Now, the Kojiri, in the process of using, did come off, and I had to glue it back on. It was just, I think, the amount of adhesive used. There wasn't a lot of it, which is good. It didn't bulb out anywhere. And I think it was hard, and in the change in temperature and whatnot, because I was using it outside in the winter, I think it cracked. And so the Kojiri came off. A little dab of super glue on either side, put it back on, and it stayed solid ever since. The taper of this eye as well, it thins out in a way that is very pleasing and nice. The lacquer work looks good. It's very smooth and doesn't have like ripples and all that kind of stuff. And the way the koiguchi up here lines up and is kind of flush with the wood is also nice. And then if I draw the sword, there's a wood liner around the metal part. So very often there's just like a metal ring, and then the wood liner doesn't come up. This is actually done up quite well, where the metal is butted up to wood, and so there's not like there's a lot less chance that you're going to scrape a metal fitting on a metal sword and scratch up the polish and whatnot. The kurigata also has some kind of texturing on here, which I think looks pretty nice, and it just kind of further stands out to me that there was a really missed opportunity to have like even just a silver raised rim around here or something. I think would have really blended the tsuba in quite well with everything. Anyway, handsome red crimson. It also came with this sageo, which is a very nice quality. It has purple and white, but it's softer to the touch and feels like a nicer silk sageo than often I get with swords. Even $3,000 swords, I think this sageo is the nicest sageo on a sword that I've gotten. Anyway, that is the scabbard. Also worth noting, doesn't rattle, doesn't fall out, and the tension is really quite good, and it's held up well. I've again used it in winter, I've used it in summer, and tension and durability, like tension in terms of not getting worse or better or staying relatively consistent throughout the seasons has been overall quite good. And I say that because I'm always wondering, like, is the Ito loose or what's going on? Is it a temperature change? But Minnesota, where I happen to live, I practice outside in sub-zero weather, and I practice outside when it's 80 above and quite humid. And so it goes through a pretty wide swing in both temperature and humidity levels, and I don't see it changing a lot. I don't see the Ito tightening or loosening. The only things that really seem to have that effect are me and lacquer. The tension on the scabbard as well doesn't seem to be tightening or loosening. It seems to always be roughly the same, regardless of temperature or humidity level where I live. So now I'll talk about the blade, the pointy stabby part, and there's a lot going on here. One, it's a complex lamination blade, meaning that it's honsenmai, and I do see what looks like forge welded lines. It gives me indication on the surface of the steel that there are some sort of complex forge welding happening here. And for $3,000, you'd hope that it is as advertised. It's also, so it's got folded steel, it's got a complex lamination, it's differentially hardened and has a hamon along the edge. And it's also got an osaraku polish, which means the tip kind of starts midway through the blade and goes all the way up. Now, historically, this was something that you might see on tanto or the occasional wakizashi, but pretty rarely, if ever, on a katana. As far as I know, Thaitsuki is the only one offering an osaraku katana that you can kind of go out and buy. So there's a lot of features, honestly, on this sword. Unfortunately, a number of them are not executed particularly well. So if I start with the general shape, no major complaints or concerns here, except for where the hamon kind of runs off. It starts to get really thin, and it gives me the impression that this blade may have been a more traditionally shaped blade that was then just kind of ground down to be an osiraku style blade. It doesn't look like it was, the hamon is super intentional where the blade transfers down. The elephant in the room is really that this osaraku polish is mediocre. It's full of scratches and whatnot. It looks like it's just kind of scuffed the other way. Now, very often with kissaki, that's how vendors tend to do it, is they just kind of sand it the other way, and it doesn't get the same level of attention as the rest of the sword, but it's only the little tip at the end. Well, when the tip is 20 inches of steel, it really stands out. And so I think a different Thaitsuki blade perhaps would have been a little bit better to send me, because I would have seen a better looking polish for a longer part of the blade and probably not harped on it so much. But when it's this much of the blade, there's just so many scratches and tool marks here that it's not ideal. Now, I do have another Osiraku tanto that I recently had polished. It's worth noting that this tanto probably cost more than this sword does. The polish was, substantial in terms of investment, but you can just kind of see a general idea of, here's a tanto with a similar style. What do I mean by this is scratch? Well, when you compare them, you don't see all these rough scuff marks in the tanto. That's kind of how this sword should look. It should have an opaque look that's not full of tool marks, and unfortunately that's largely what I see here. It kind of looks unfinished. Now, the rest of the polish, if I look at the good end, it's still, the hamon is not brought out super well. The polish on the hada is also subtle, and it's unfortunate. Now, if I compare it to the other folks that are out there, Evolution Blades and Citadel, those are the two in my mind that I compare to. Citadel has debatably the same kind of not great polish, but Citadel has a little cleaner lines, and the kissaki is at least better done. But the polish isn't necessarily any better. Moto-haba, or Evolution Blades, also has cleaner lines, and they actually do, I think, bring out more characteristics in the steel of a sword that isn't folded than Thaitsuki is on a steel that is. The hada is very subtle, and you really have to peer in there to see some of the details. It's there, but I think a better polish would really kind of bring out a lot of the cool characteristics in this sword. I think there is actually a lot here, but it's being obscured a little bit by what seems to me to be not the best polish. Anyway, I can make out a hada. What's there looks very nice. I can make out forge welding lines for the complex lamination. They're pretty to see. The hamon also has a nice flow to it until I kind of get up to the end here where it thins out a little bit in a way that is not ideal. The other complaint that I'd have is that the shinogi is soft. And ideally on a $3,000 sword, this is really, really crisp and doesn't have kind of a soft, rounded entry to the bevels of the edge bevel. And if you look in Citadel, if you look in Evolution Blades, it's a very crisp, clean line, and this one, it doesn't waver, but it's just soft, like there's some buffing that's happened. Anyway, there is an attempt, though, at a mirror polished spine and then a more opaque bevel area here, which is certainly nice to see. It's just unfortunate that there's a lot of features happening on the sword, and you're paying for a complex lamination, but it's tougher to see, and those characteristics aren't brought out. So you've got folded and laminated steel, but it's just tough to see that money spent here because of the polish. And then the Osiraku shape, it's interesting and compelling, but it doesn't seem particularly well executed. Now I can talk a little bit about doing EI with it. And the first thing to note is the Ito coming loose happened in roughly 3 or 4 sessions, and then it started coming loose, and gradually I was trying to fix it. And anyway, it wasn't a pleasant part. And eventually I had to lacquer the handle to get it totally secure, and now it's not as comfortable as it was. So that is it was a major problem in doing EI with it at first, but now that that's resolved, it's not standing in the way, and The bulbous handle is, I suppose, the other deterrent there. It's not a problem. You get used to it, but you shouldn't have to get used to it. And I think you're looking for a little bit more elegance. And unfortunately, the loose ito and the bulbous handle are not as elegant as you might hope for the money. That said, other parts of the sword are fine. It draws well. It's quiet. It's a very pleasant using sword in the other ways in terms of sheathing and drawing, and it's fun to move around. It's a little bit on the hefty feeling side. Measurements and all that are in the description down below, but at the same time, not uncomfortable, and it has a charm to moving it around, and it's reasonably graceful in the hand once you get the ito tight. The other factor that's worth noting about EI, which isn't necessarily about doing Iaido, is it got a lot of attention in my dojo. So a lot of people came up and asked me about this sword and its features, and were curious about it because it has this kind of bold red look to it. It's not blingy in the sense that it's like a disco ball reflecting light in everyone's eyes in the dojo and going to get you kicked out. It just has a well, it makes people curious, I guess. I got asked about it a lot more than I had other swords, and I thought that was interesting, that it made people curious about it enough to come up and approach me and talk to me about it. Anyway, that's using it, and overall it's now comfortable enough to use, but still not my favorite. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about cutting with the sword, and more or less I cut a lot of different mediums: pool noodles, water bottles, tatami mats, some rolled cardboard tubes, a bunch of different stuff. Things that are debatably going towards abusive, but not like 2x4s, not steel bars or anything like that. So in the process of using it, I would say it cuts just fine. I do note that if I don't make it through a target, that bulbous metal piece wants to break my grip a little bit, or the bulbous part of the handle wants to break my grip apart a little bit, but I don't feel shock in my hand, and overall it's reasonably comfortable to use. In cutting tatami, what stands out though is that this sword is, again, competing with Evolution Blades and Citadel, both of which cut extremely well. And I would say the Evolution Blades is kind of towards the top. That's their claim to fame, though. The Citadel blade also is no slouch, though. I've cut 4 rolls of tatami with a Citadel. They do an excellent job cutting, and they have a good profile as well. This seems like a sword that can cut, but I don't think it's doing as much work for me as those other swords. It seems to be a little bit more around the features and less about the specific tatami grass cutting performance. So it cuts, it thrusts, it's fine to move around. It's got a little bit of authority in the cut. If you don't make it through, the bulbousness wants to break your grip a little bit, but it's not like an amazing cutter. It's perfectly sharp and competent and does well, but it's not kind of doing the work for you, if you get what I'm throwing down. Anyway, those were my experiences cutting. I did have a lot of fun cutting with it. It was a little bit different, but at the same time, it didn't wow me. All right, sword friends, that is all the information I can give you. Hopefully what I've shown you in the video and what I've talked about in terms of using it has given you enough information to decide if it's worth your hard-earned money or not. But I can answer that question myself now. Do I personally think it's worth the $3,000 asking price? And in short, I would say no. No, I don't think so. I think it's well off that, in fact. But it's not that I don't think there's room for it. If I look at what Citadel and Evolution Blades, 2 companies that I've been comparing it to throughout the course of this video, I still definitely think there's room there. Evolution Blades is really kind of focused on the practitioner side of things, and they forego complex lamination techniques and kind of different blade shapes. They focus a little bit more on the cutting side of things. Not to say they can't make other swords, but that seems to be what they're best known for. Citadel does a lot of handmade-y type stuff and also puts things together well, but has some ideas on blade shape that maybe not everyone agrees with. Making a different style traditional blade that incorporates precious metals, has complex lamination, folded steel and whatnot is a compelling thing that I think people are worth paying, are going to like to pay for, or may want a high-end option of. And I do think that it's a little bit more competitive if I think of what I've gotten from Mass in the past, or martial arts swords, or Hanwei, if I look at some of their really, really high-end katana and some of the problems that they've had. At the same time, I'm just not seeing $3,000 here. There's too many issues that you could buy a product for $3,000 that wouldn't have these issues, and they're really glaring ones. The loose ito and kashira coming off is a problem, and because they're in Thailand, sending a sword back for repair is a tricky one. The shaping on the handle is another one, not something easy to resolve, and the polish work on the blade. No, it's not acceptable at a $3,000 price point. Now, there are a ton of features here: precious metals, complex laminations. There's a lot being attempted here, and I do think you get a lot in the sword. I think it's an interesting offering, but too many of those things have issues for me to say I would recommend it at $3,000 or $2,000. It needs some work. However, If all of those things were corrected and you got a sword that had tight ito, and had shaping that was good, and that had a polish that was commensurate with the sword at the level, I would say yes. It didn't fall apart. It has some cool features. I like the precious metals, but there's just some things that need to be resolved. I do want to incidentally note that also some correction on some of the fittings so that you don't see some of the grind marks and whatnot. I'm not going to ding it for the Kojiri coming off, though. That's a simple glue thing. A lot of companies have it, and I'd rather they use too little that can be easily repaired, because a dab of glue and putting it on was not beyond me, and most things are. So that I'm not actually too perturbed about, and the scabbard in all other ways was absolutely excellent. So anyway, no would be my answer, but I do think there's room for them to resolve those issues and put out a more compelling product that absolutely is worth it. In this particular case, though, there's just too many little things that I could pick apart that I don't think you should have to for a sword in this price point, particularly not when there are competitors out there that basically offer something very similar without those problems. The downside is, if you want something that does have a complex lamination technique with folded steel, your options are pretty limited in the high-end space. So there isn't somebody that really executes on it particularly well at the moment that you could ask Citadel or Evolution Blades what they could do for you. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I do want to offer a special thanks to Jack at Thaitsuki for sending the sword my way for review. Hopefully you guys all found it interesting. That's all I've got. Cheers, and thanks for watching.